last presenter for this afternoon, yours truly, who would be presenting on the role of corrections, the role of corrections in the CJ system. And I just love corrections. Um, yes, the military was my first love, and then I transferred over into social services as a probation officer, and they assigned me to HMP then back in 1998 after coming home from university. And I fell in love with the institution. And I've been at the institution now since 1998. I worked as a part-time lecturer. I taught recruits introduction to corrections, introduction to criminal justice, and something else I did there. And so I've been doing a lot of work there for many of years. And when I'm there, I'm at home. And I've always gotten support from all of the commissioners and superintendents over the years, from a Majesty's prison into Bahamas Department of Correctional Services. And many of their officers, believe it or not, have actually done certification that is internationally recognized with and through the National Lead Institute. And many of them attended conferences, even 4 of them attended conferences when we had a training conferences in Raleigh, North Carolina. And so you see, even the correctional system actually work out of silos. So without further delay, let me get into this afternoon presentation with breaking the role of corrections into the criminal justice system. The objectives basically is to reintroduce the CJ system to participants, because many of you know about the CJ system, to expose participants to the terms and processes of the CJ system, and to look at corrections from yesterday, today, and the future in a general view. Now, the reason why I chose is because, I love corrections. I just love corrections. And most of my training is in community corrections. And so basically, when we talk about corrections, we will be talking corrections in its entirety, because there are 2 segments of corrections. You have institutional corrections, where you have the facility with as BDOTs, and then you have community corrections with a lot of NGOs and civil society, as well as probation, and now coming on stream parole will be a part of community corrections. And all of those 2 make up the entire state of corrections. So introduction, goals of the criminal justice system is doing justice. In the criminal justice, offenders are held fully accountable for their actions. The rights of persons who have contact with the system will be protected. Like offenses will be treated alike, and officials will take into account relevant differences among offenders and offenses. Now, basically, this is the theoretical point of view, and many of you practitioners might see it doing differently on the ground, but what you need to do is bring everything back in line of what theoretically it should be and the reality that you have to work with on the ground. Secondly, is controlling crime. Procedures and legal processes used by the criminal justice system: arrest, prosecution, adjudication, and punishment. Then you have it as preventing crime. Use things such as general deterrence and specific deterrence. Let's look at some of the characteristics of the criminal justice system. There's discretion, where you use of one's own judgment without referring to rules. And you have a latitude, certain latitude of discretion working in the criminal justice system, whether you're working in corrections, whether you're working in what we call law enforcement or the police segment of the criminal justice system, there's a level of discretion that one has as it relates to referring to the rules. And I can give you a tidbit. Let's look at law enforcement. An officer meets a young man and he finds him at one small joint that he was smoking. He can make a judgment call and say, okay, then what we will do is we will not charge you, but we will arrest you and we will take you in and you will have to go through a program and we'll take it from a community standpoint. And some of these things has happened and are happening that help a lot of young people and older persons alike. And it usually, the discretions usually happens with very trivial minor offenses, although they are important and should not be swept under the rug. But that's where, in many instances, discretion can be and sometimes used. Then you have resource dependence. You have the criminal justice agencies do not ordinarily create their own resources like fines and fines and any other forfeitures are an exceptions because you have where there's traffic offenses and some other fines that you got to pay through the court system, but rather really on other agencies for funding. In other words, they are beholden to politicians. So basically the criminal justice system in itself is beholden to the policymakers who determine and decide what is the budget for these agencies. And then sometimes some agencies suffer more than others. And what I have experienced in my tenure locally and internationally working in the criminal justice system, and that's been over 20 years working in the criminal justice system, basically what I've experienced is that corrections usually get the short end of the stick. And in my estimation, corrections is one of the most important part of the criminal justice system. And I will share with you why I say that. So the third characteristic of the criminal justice system is sequential task. Decisions in the criminal justice system are made in specific order or sequence. The police must arrest before the case is passed to the prosecutor. This is the key to the exchange relationships among the justice system and decision makers. The system is highly interdependent. That means the three tiers of the criminal justice system, which is law enforcement, the court system, and corrections, they are highly interdependent to make the criminal justice system work. And I always tell policymakers and I always tell individuals, if one of those tiers or one of those pillars is weakened, then we have a weakened criminal justice system. Like we used to say in the military, a chain is as strong as its weakest link. So if corrections is weak in the criminal justice system because of the inadequacy of resources and infrastructure that should be given from the policymakers to the agencies, then your criminal justice system will be weak. So no matter how much arrests police make and drugs they find, if the infrastructure is not there in place, if the officers are not there in place, if programs and rehabilitation mechanisms are not in place in the correctional system, you will have a revolving door. Because we have another saying, 94%, or actually 95% of individual leaving the correctional system or serving time in the correctional system will come home. The question is not when they are coming home. The question will be how they're coming home. And that is a national security issue. So the fourth characteristic of the criminal justice system is filtering, which is a screening operation. The criminal justice system is often described as a funnel. Many cases enter it, but only a few results in conviction and punishment. So you see thousands and thousands of cases enter through the criminal justice system, but only few ever get conviction, and, and few of those convictions ever get punishment. And there are three, and I said it before, there are three main subsystems of the criminal justice system. You have the police, you have the courts, and you have corrections. The police are the gatekeepers of the system in the United States. And I use this because we have persons from the US and the Caribbean and the Bahamas on this call. And also we have, in the United States, we have over 50 federal agencies. There are nearly 18,000 state and local agencies. In the Bahamas, we have one main system or agency. Although they might say, yeah, the defense force is part of law enforcement, they might do some law enforcement duty, but theoretically, the defense force is not a part of law enforcement, and they're not a part of the police, like in the US, where you'll have the sheriffs who run the jail. They're law enforcement, but still your part of their department runs the jail as well. All right. And corrections is not a part of law enforcement. Prison is not a part of corrections. Prison is not a part of law enforcement. Prison is a part of corrections, which should have their own set of budget, own set of processes for even promotion and everything else that goes through and stuff like that. But anyway, I will not rush the gate on this one. So in the Bahamas, like I said, we have one main system or agency. Then we have the courts. We have the courts determine guilty or innocent. They sentence guilty defendants, determine whether constitutional rights are being violated. In the US, you have interpret the Constitution in the US context at federal and state levels. In the Bahamas, we have it at three levels. We have national, which is magistrate, supreme, and court of appeal. Then we have the local level, which is tribunal. And then also we have what we call the court, which is outside of our land, which is the highest court that actually do not operate within the land. That's the Privy Council. And then you have corrections. Corrections, one of the tasks for corrections is to punish the guilty, reform the offender. And so that's two areas of corrections. And that should even be even more broader than just punish the guilty, reform the offender. But I will go more into that as we get into corrections. So there are four major duties of police: keep the peace, apprehending violators and combating crime, smallest amount, preventing crime, providing social services. And the flow goes like this: the flow of decision-making for the police: investigation, arrest, booking. And so the circle goes from investigation, booking, and arrest. And then you have the flow of decision-making process for the courts. You have charging, initial appearance, bail set, preliminary inquiry, or voluntary, what we call VBI, voluntary bill of indictment. And then you have the trial. And that circle of decision-making goes like this: charging, initial appearance, bail set, preliminary inquiry, or VBI, voluntary bill of indictment, trial. There are some other steps that can happen in the court system where there's mediation in some instances, but we wouldn't go into the technicality of it all. But I just wanted to give you an overview of how the processes work theoretically in the criminal justice system from a general perspective. Then we have the flow of decision-making process, courts, corrections. Arraignment, you have either a magistrate or a judge. You have trial, either by jury or bench. You have sentencing, either by judge or magistrate. You have appeal by higher courts. And so this is how the flow goes from arraignment to trial to sentencing to higher appeal or higher courts of appeal. And so you have the criminal justice system is like a wedding cake. Layer one, cases that are highly unusual receive much public attention, result in jury trial or bench, and often drag on through many appeals. And I know you are aware of many cases, especially drug cases, where persons been through the courts for years with their appeals. And then you have layer two, which are major offenses in the Bahamas in the US as felonies that are considered serious by officials. And then you have layer three, consists of major offenses, but the crimes and the offenders are seen as less important than those in layer two. And then you have layer four, which are minor offenses or misdemeanors, of which about 90% of all cases fall into this category. So 90% of all cases that fall in this category, the question I would ask, why do the Bahamas, or why did the Bahamas, or why is the Bahamas have such a high rate of incarceration per capita for the English speaking Caribbean? That's a question for you to think about. So the disparity is simply a difference between groups, and such differences can often explain by legitimate factors. And then you have discrimination occurs when groups are differently treated without regard to their behavior or qualification. And a lot of times, especially in disparity and in discrimination, we see socioeconomic areas or socioeconomic discrimination happening, where if somebody is from a social economic or socioeconomic grouping or neighborhood, they are sometimes treated differently than somebody who's from the inner city, or what we call Bain Town, or what we might call in some instances the ghetto. That can happen as well. So then in the criminal justice system, you have the crime control model, which is a model of criminal justice system that assumes freedom is so important that every effort must be made to repress crime, emphasizes on efficiency, speed, finality, and the capacity to apprehend, try, convict, and dispose of high proportion of the offenders. I know with COVID, a lot of things have slowed down. And I even appeared sometimes to give reports in court now during COVID online, virtually. So, but in certain instances, even like with the juvenile offenders, since COVID-19, juvenile court has yet to meet. And that means that justice is not being carried out for that segment of our society. Order is most important value. Then you have due process model. This is a model of criminal justice system that assumes freedom is so important that every effort must be made to ensure that criminal justice decisions are based on reliable information, not just hearsay or somebody trying to malign your character or slander you. Emphasis, the adversarial process, the rights of defendants, and formal decision-making procedures. Theoretically, this is what's supposed to happen. We know through experience in our different jurisdictions, different countries, a lot of these things were not happening like it should happen. In this case, in the due process model, law is the most important value. Let's look at the definition of crime. Well, mala and se, which is offenses that are wrong by their very own nature. Then you have mala prohibita, which are offenses prohibited by law, but not wrong in themselves. Like, let's go to mala and se, offenses that are wrong by their very own nature. A lot of sexual offenses that occur in our country basically, by the nature of the offense, it is wrong totally. And they the kind of crimes what in the Latin term is called mala in se. And then mala prohibita, which are offenses prohibited by law but not wrong in themselves. Like the law states that you should get a license to sell coconut on the side of the road. And so actually selling coconut uh, from your car or on the side of the road or even from your home, coconut water and so forth, is not really wrong in themselves, but the law itself makes it wrong. So hopefully you get, I explained the difference here with you between mala in se and mala prohibitor. And then you have classification of crime. You have misdemeanors of crime punishable by up to 1 year in jail. In the Bahamas, we do not have a jail. We only have prison and a remand center. In the US, they have jails and prison. The jails are run by the state or actually the county, and the sheriff department in most instances basically runs the jail. Then your felony crimes punishable by up to 1 year in prison. All right. And you have 6 types of crimes. You have visible crimes, often called street crimes. That's what people always get off on, like the shoplifting, the armed robberies, the homicides. And then you have 3 categories. You have violent crimes, your property crimes, and your public order crimes. So you have 6 types of crimes. Continue occupational crime, committed within the context of legal business or profession. And you heard a lot about, especially during COVID, you have a lot of fraudulent crimes that are going on. And sometimes we call it white collar crime. Then you have organized crime. This with the gangs or drug syndicate. Not a criminal act per se, but a framework within which criminal acts are planned and committed. In some jurisdiction, they have made being involved with gangs and so forth as a crime now. Okay? And planned and committed often provides goods that cannot be obtained legally. Of course, you know, it's drugs. Some instances, it might be alcohol. Then you have number 4, victimless crime. Crimes without victims involve a willing and private exchange of goods and services that are in strong demand but illegal. Participants feel that they are not being harmed. Then you have political crime, an act usually committed for ideological purposes that constitutes a threat against the state. Example of political crime, you have sedition. And you know, if you're watching CNN and all of those things with the thing that's happening, the thing that happened on November, I think it was January 6th on Capitol Hill, you have stuff like that where persons were charged with sedition. Even some persons were charged with espionage because they stole certain things and give it to the enemy of the state outside the country. And you have treason. Then you have cybercrime, which is really moving up, and it's up there where people stealing your data through your computer, people breaking into your phones and so forth. So you have involved the use of computers and internet to commit acts against people, property, public order, or morality. Types of cybercrimes, you have pornography, especially child pornography. A lot of that has been going on throughout the Caribbean. You have stalking, you have hacking, and you have fraud. The list there is not exhaustive. So explaining criminal behavior. Most people who study criminal behavior agree that no one explanation would account for certain types of heinous crime. Rather, we would have to look to a combination of biological, psychological, and social causes. Biological and sociological explanations assume that criminal behavior results from physical or mental conditions that distinguish criminals from non-criminals. They tell us about individual cases, but they do not explain why crime rates vary from one place to another or one situation to another. So most people who study criminal behavior agree that not one explanation would occur for certain types of heinous crime. Rather, we would have to look at a combination of biological, sociological, psychological, and social causes for crime. Sociological explanation differs from biological and psychological explanations in that they look for cases of criminal behavior in the environment in which a person grows up. Then you have causes of crime. You have classical, Becarial states crime previously explained in supernatural terms. Then you have the five principles, rational theory, your positive school theory, what happens in the mid 1800s, scientific method. There are three principles of that. Then you have the biological explanation, which Lombroso actually came up with, and criminogenic Nazis. And then you have the psychological explanation, which explanation of crime that emphasizes mental process and behavior. Early personality development is a key factor in later behavior, largely criticized and ignored. And that's why mental health issues and mental illness is becoming high on the agenda of criminologists and social workers and correctional officers and even police officers. Then you have the life course theories, and you have the sociological explanations, which from strain and anomie. Okay, and then you have 7 principles of criminal law: legality. There must be a law that defines specific action as a crime. Offensive and harmful behavior is not illegal unless it has been prohibited by law first. And then you have the actus reus, which is for a crime to occur, there must be an act or either commission or omission by the accused. And then you have one of my favorite, I obviously say, you have mens rea, I didn't what mens rea. You have causation. For a crime to have been committed, there must be a causal relationship between an act and the harm suffered. Then you have harm. To be a crime, an act must cause harm to some person or property. Then you have concurrence, which is for an act to be considered a crime, the intent and the act must be present at the same time. Then you have mens rea, the guilty mind. The commission of the act is not a crime unless it's accompanied by a guilty state of mind. The intent to commit a crime, it is most crucial principle in terms of establishing punishment, establishing if something is a crime. So the last of the 7 principles of criminal law is punishment. There must be a provision in the law calling for punishment of those found guilty of violating law. The punishment is enforced by government and may carry with social stigma, criminal record, loss of freedom, and loss of rights. In many instances, in many states, where persons would have committed crime and they came out, some persons cannot vote for X amount of time. Some persons can't get business license for you to do even electronic work or barbering because they have a criminal record. Okay, and so all of these things are dealt with in that. Then you have procedural criminal law defines how the system must process a case designed to protect individual rights and enforce due process. Then you have the substantive criminal law and procedural criminal law defined by legislators. Procedural criminal law is defined by courts. Okay, and so basically our parliament defines what you call it, substantive law, and the procedural law is basically defined by our courts. That's all it's saying. In the US, you know, you have the 4th Amendment. The 4th Amendment, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. And we have that in our constitutional law, protection against unreasonable, because a lot of times the police force get sued for unreasonable searches and seizures a lot of times, but you don't hear that in the media. And then you have in the 5th Amendment in the US Constitution, it has protection against self-incrimination and double jeopardy. And in our laws, the same thing, we have a protection against self-incrimination and double jeopardy. And then the 6th Amendment, the right to counsel and fair trial, and the right to a speedy trial and impartial jury. In our laws, it's the same thing. Rights to counsel, fair trial, and a right to speedy trial. And that's why you see persons who will spend 2 years or more in jail. Thank you. Who spend 2 years or more in jail, apply for bail and get bail. Okay, because they don't have They call speedy trial. Then a protection against excessive bail, excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. In our laws, you're protected by that as well, theoretically. And if you have a good lawyer, in many instances, you can get your funding back, you can get your monies back, you can sue the government, you can sue the police for these kind of things. And in the 14th Amendment in the US Constitution, you have no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and all citizens have the right to equal protection under the law. And in our laws, it's the same thing. Okay, so the history, let's look at the history of institutional corrections. How has a long history from the workhouse or houses of corrections of Holland, England, and colonial Pennsylvania through the penitentiary movement, the reformatory movement, and the medical model of confinement to the contemporary prison and jail. The treatment of prisoners evolved from the rule of terror, brutality, to the rule of law. Can you imagine a world without prisons? Impossible, right? Well, it existed till the very end of the Middle Ages, but jails were always around. Then you had the workhouse movement. The idea that prisoners should perform useful labor was revived in Holland, England during the 16th century. These were in fact the first prisons. Then you had prison hulks where you had decommissioned ships converted into prisons. And you had some of them of the state of New York. Then you had the penitentiary movement. Many of you heard about Alcatraz and stuff like that. Prison or place of confinement and corrections for persons convicted of criminal acts, originally a place where convicts did penance. This was popular under the Quakers in Philadelphia Walnut Street Jail. And then the penitentiary movement continued. Your New York and Pennsylvania were the leaders in building larger penitentiaries. But in mid-19th century, it became clear that these fortresses of cruelty could not achieve penance. And what is happening, we even moved down to private prisons and so forth, what actually became like slave houses, to be more of a better terminology. And since the new administration took over in the US, it was an executive order to actually move away now from private prison, because we found out, researchers found out that private prison does not give you the effective success you're looking for rehabilitation, reintegration of the offenders. It only serves as a revolving door, having inmates or the clients coming back to make profits for those who run those private institutions. And then the next phase the prison system went through is the reformatory movement. Institution designed to reform criminals through individualized treatment, education, and vocational training. Realizing their lack of success, prison reformers in the 20th century invented the medical model of rehabilitation so as to make the reformatory more effective. And then you came into the rehabilitation model. And that's where we came moving into corrections. The rehabilitation model that emerged from houses of corrections, penitentiaries, and reformatories was based on indeterminate sentencing, careful classification, and treatment. Classification was an elaborate, systematic diagnosis and prescription. Just like when you go to see a doctor, they do intake, they do screening, assessment, and treatment plan. All of this was a part of the rehabilitation model. On classification, inmates would be assigned to programs involving psychotherapy, vocational training, and education. And it's now in corrections where you get more than just psychotherapy, vocational training, and education. You get actually mental health issues, you get treatment, you get mental health treatment, you get substance abuse or substance use disorder treatment, and the whole likes of it. Offenders would be retrained, socialized, rehabilitated, and reintegrated as socially skilled citizens. The results of most programs were disappointing, if you believe it, in the rehabilitation model. And this is why even at BDOCs, this might be the case. The results of most programs were disappointing due to the facility not changing to accommodate this model. It was only offered to a small segment of inmate population. And this is the same cry that we have at BDOCS. It offered to a small population. The infrastructure of the facility is not prepared. I've traveled to Trinidad, Barbados, Guyana. I saw same prisons there, Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos, St. Lucia. And all of these countries have the same issue. I know in St. Lucia, they would have built on Trinidad. Trinidad, actually, to my amazement, I mean, they have 8 to 9 facilities with a lower rate ratio per inmate for the country, for the amount of persons in versus what we have here in the Bahamas. And under the rehabilitation model, I know there are some improvements happening at BDOCS. And it might not be going fast enough for many persons, but there are improvements. And for holistically around the Caribbean, we're looking to change the model, the facility, and probably look at alternative sentencing. Today, I only focus on institutional corrections, and tomorrow we'll focus on community corrections, which has a greater impact on the rehabilitation and reintegration of offenders. So institutional corrections today. There are 2 categories of prison facilities, detention and correctional. Detention facilities normally do not house convicted inmates. Normally, but you'll find in some and many, they do have convicted inmates. And are not technically correctional facilities because they don't have the program, design, and processes for rehabilitation for those. They only housing for the purpose of adjudication of the offenders through the court system. A facility that houses persons arrested and undergoing processing, awaiting trial, or awaiting transfer to a correctional facility. That's what a detention facility is. Correctional facility is a facility where convicted offenders serve their sentence. Includes county jails and state and federal prisons. And in the Bahamas, basically, we have prisons and we have maximum, medium, minimum. You have the remand center, and then you have the annex isn't really up and running like it should be, but now with SAFE, the policymaker SAFE rule coming on, pilot program next month, we'll see how fast that goes. Then jail in the US is place of confinement administered by local officials and designed to hold prisoners from 48 hours, but usually less than 1 year. In the Bahamas, the jails that we have are attached to the police stations, whether it's in the Family Islands or in New Providence. Prisons in the US, your federal or state penal institution in which offenders serve sentences longer than 1 year. The Bahamas Department of the Correctional System, current goals equal just security. Culture change goals equals security, then the well-being of staff, then the rehabilitation of inmates. The Bahamas Department of Corrections, formerly Her Majesty's Prison, in accordance with universally accepted standards, contributions to the protection of society by optimizing staff development while maintaining inmates in a controlled, safe, secure, and humane environment that encourages rehabilitation and successful reintegration into society. And that brings me to the end of correctional role in the criminal justice system. As I stated before, corrections is one tier of the criminal justice system. And if that area is found to be weakened, then you will have a revolving door. In many jurisdictions across the Caribbean and even in the United States, corrections receive minuscule budget, and corrections receive the least amount of resources needed to run effectively. And so it is for us professionals, by breaking silos, by utilizing stakeholders to help with your resources and to help with training of your officers and to help with the rehabilitation and reintegration of the offender who's going to return back to his or her community in a more safer, peaceful, and productive way. Thank you. We have comments in the chat group. Thank you. Excellent topic from Frederica King. Excellent topic. Awesome presenter. Education Informative would like to see programs introduce youth programs, Ministry of Education, private school via counseling department as a subject. Awesome, awesome. That's something. Good. Let me thank you for being with us from 9:30, and we'll be back at 9:30 in the morning with the next set of speakers, and we will have a panel tomorrow evening, tomorrow afternoon, which will close out. So thank you once again.